to the Eric Metaxas Show.
It's the show that answers the questions, could you milk a cockroach?
By the way, cockroach milk is really yummy. Some would even say nummy.
This announcement has been brought to you by the Cockroach Dairy Council.
And now the man who once wrangled cockroaches for a living in Kansas City,
Eric Metaxas.
How does he know that about me? I've never shared that with anyone. Folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. Have I got a show for you? Are you ready? Buckle your seatbelts, folks. I'm sitting here in the studio with Mary Neal, MD. That stands for medical doctor in English. Mary Neal, MD. You may know her from her previous book, To Heaven and Back, a doctor's extraordinary account of her death, heaven, angels, and life again. Mary Neal, I can't believe you're here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Not a lot of my guests have died, at least not when they come on the program. Usually people could die afterward, but it's very rare. You have experienced something that everybody wonders, what would it be like? You've experienced it, and it's one of the reasons I get so excited. I actually blurbed your new book because I said, this is amazing. Your new book really gets into the stuff even better. It's called 7 Lessons from Heaven, How Dying Taught Me to Live a Joy-Filled Life. Where in the world do we begin? What year, when did this accident happen to you?
Well, this accident actually happened in 1999.
Okay, so that's when you died, you drowned in a kayak.
I did. It's hard to say actually that I died because I'm here.
You seem pretty good to me. I don't know.
I know, exactly. But there is no doubt that by all definitions, I would have been dead. I was underwater for 30 minutes without oxygen before CPR began.
Okay. Now, Mary C. Neal, MD, you are a medical doctor. So I want to say to people, this is not just some friend of mine telling a story, which I still would think would be true, but you're a medical doctor. So
I'm a spine surgeon, no less. I'm very concrete thinking and analytical. I am
You're not like one of those
creative.
Freudian quacks. You're an actual doctor. Okay,
Yes.
So you're a spine surgeon. You live in what, Wyoming?
Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Okay.
Yes.
So you were into kayaking.
Yes. My husband and I had kayaked for many, many years.
Okay, did you have kids?
We had 4 young kids.
Okay, at the time you had 4 young kids, and you're still a maniac. You're doing spine surgery, and you're kayaking.
No, I'm going to correct you. We were not maniacs.
You were not?
Actually, no, because that's a point I want to make. We'd been kayaking for many years, and we're very skilled kayakers. This was not something
No, when
that
I
was
say
crazy.
maniacs, I don't mean that you're like crazy in the way you kayak, but the idea that you've got 4 kids, you're doing spine surgery as a doctor, and you're a kayaker. You know,
we had a very busy life.
Yeah, obviously. Okay, so one day you're kayaking. Many people listening to the program don't know your story. One
Right.
day in 1999, you're kayaking. What happens?
Well, we were actually in South America. It
Oh,
was
okay.
the
I'm
first
sorry.
time we
I read the book. I forgot. You're in South
Right.
America kayaking.
Well, we had finally thought that our youngest child was old enough for us to leave town, which, of course, is a watershed day. So we went to South America with friends of ours who are professionals. They're not only professional
kayakers.
boaters. Yes. They own a rafting kayak company. They run trips. They're also EMTs. I mean, this is what they do. And we went with them to South America. The day of my accident, actually, my husband did not kayak on the river with us because he woke up for the first and only time with back pain. And this particular part of the river required total commitment. And so I was on the river with these dear friends of ours and then some other clients. And inadvertently, circumstances were such that I went over a waterfall that was a notable waterfall. And instead of hitting the bottom and being flipped and spit out downstream, the front end of my boat became pinned or stuck in the rocks and underwater features. And so the boat and I were immediately submerged under 8 to 10 feet of water.
And just to be clear, this is a freak accident. This is not the kind of thing that normally happens when your friends running a business doing this. This is not the kind of thing that they're expecting to happen.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, this is a nightmare.
Yes, actually, it is for
So
them.
you go over the waterfall and your kayak gets pinned. You're under 8 to 10 feet. That's a lot of water.
It is. In fact, they couldn't even see me. They didn't know where I was.
I mean, you obviously were driven down by the force of the water.
Right, exactly. But no, they had absolutely no idea. It took them about 15 minutes to even figure out where they thought I and the boat must be because usually in kayaking, either you see the boat or you see the kayaker out of the boat, but they're not both missing. So
you vanished.
I vanished.
And you're under 8 to 10 feet of water. Do you remember anything, or do you immediately become unconscious?
I remember everything as precisely as I remember this moment in time. I didn't panic. I didn't experience fear. I understood my predicament. I'm a very concrete thinking person and tried, of course, to free the boat, tried to free me from the boat, but the pressure and the force of the water was such that I couldn't move at all. I was absolutely pressed to the front deck of the boat. And at that point, no, I didn't have an experience of being conscious and then unconscious. I had an experience of being conscious and then more conscious, sort of being alive and then more alive. And it was while I was still underwater that I asked that God's will be done. And
now, let me ask you, when this happened, were you a serious Christian at that point in your life?
Well, the short answer is no. I think I was a very typical kid of the Midwest in the 1950s. I grew up being taken to church. I went through confirmation. I did all those things. And then I went off to college and medical school and joined the religion of the intellect. You know, science was preeminent. And then when I had my own children, I did take them to church, but I think I did it more as a way to give them a moral foundation rather than the idea of actually living your faith, because those are two very different things.
In other words, you're not, when this accident happens, you're not a woman walking around talking about Jesus or, or saying I'm a born again or evangelical. You're just a doctor.
I think I was a regular old, typical American quote Christian. When I look back on it now, I certainly bought into the concept of being a good person and honest and ethical and all of those things. And I think I would have said yes. I think there's something more after death, but I certainly never really thought about it. And I look back on it now and I think that, like so many people in this country, I was sort of a cultural Christian. I went to church, but that was sort of a compartmentalized activity, different from living and breathing faith.
Well, I would say most of the people that I know in the world, are people like that.
Yeah.
These are good people, but they don't have the experience of faith that I have had. They're not sure what they believe. They're not reading the Bible regularly. They're not going to a church where they're hearing, the kind of sermons that I hear, just like average Americans. So when this happens to you, you say you're driven out of the water. You do not go unconscious. You're conscious. You're trying to free yourself, but the pressure of the water is so outrageous you cannot move.
Exactly.
Okay, so at what point, what happens then?
Well, for the first time in my life, I didn't recite the entire Lord's Prayer, but I did ask that God's will be done. And I think for the first time in my life, I actually meant it. Because like so many Christians in the U.S., we say the Lord's Prayer in which we ask for God's will to be done, but what we really want is we want God's will to be done as long as it's in line with our own and on our own timetable. And I was sort of typical, but I asked that God's will be done regardless of the outcome. And the moment I asked that, I was immediately overcome with a very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured that everything was fine.
Okay, so you're underwater. How many seconds into it do you pray this prayer?
I would guess it was probably in the 5 to 7 minute range.
Wait a minute. You're still conscious underwater? There's no oxygen?
I had no oxygen, and I was not conscious in that sense. But I was definitely conscious in that I was still very aware of my circumstances. When I was being held by Christ and reassured and taken through this life review and all of these things, I had this parallel thought.
But I don't want to leap ahead. In other words, to me, as soon as this happens to you, right? You're underwater. At what point does the lack of oxygen? In other words, I would guess that you would drown 2 or 3 minutes into this.
That's more typical. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, anoxia affects your brain very quickly.
Oh, we've got to go to a break. Folks, I'm sorry. We'll be right back talking to Mary Neal.
How does it feel?
I was saying, and it's the Eric Metaxas Show. I am talking to Mary Neal, MD, who died and went to heaven and eventually made her way to this studio, which is really hard to believe. Mary, I'm just so thrilled that you're here. Your book, 7 Lessons from Heaven, How Dying Taught Me to Live a Joyful Life. It's mind-blowing. I want everybody to understand this is real. You're a doctor. So I just want to go back before you get to the really exciting stuff. You know, you are underwater for quite a while. Now, normally, I would think you would at some point black out and become unconscious. Somehow this did not happen to you. Medically, what happened?
Well, it's interesting because I've always been afraid of a drowning death. I always thought that would be a terrible way to die. But what I discovered is a number of things. First of all, where God's love is present, there is no room for fear. There is no room for any destructive emotion. And so I never felt air hunger. I never felt fear.
Air hunger.
Right, which is typically what someone would experience when they're drowning.
Well, I was going to say, if I'm underwater for 60 or 60 seconds or 2 minutes or something, I just assume that I panic, I breathe water in, and I die. How is it possible that you didn't do that for 5 to 7 minutes? What is going on?
God was present.
Okay, even before you prayed the prayer, God, thy will be done, you felt the presence of God somehow.
I did, and perhaps when I think about 5 to 7 minutes, that's probably too long.
Okay.
There was absolutely a shift in time and dimension. I was underwater for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I know that because the friends of mine had watches and they were timing things. This is what they do. And I know that only from them. From my own experience, it felt like many, many hours. And so when I talk about how long before I prayed that prayer, I'm guessing.
All right. So anyway, let's just go back. So you're underwater. Something happens to you. So tell us, what happens?
So the moment that I asked for God's will to be done, I was immediately enveloped with a very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured by Christ that everything was fine.
Now, were you surprised that it was Jesus?
I was shocked.
You were shocked?
Because although I certainly bought into the concept of being a good person, and as I said, I would have said I was a Christian, I certainly didn't deserve to be held. And that was really the first of many profound realizations for me, because none of us deserve it. Even though we live in this society that, talks about reward and punishment, the fact is none of us deserve God's love.
Right.
And so
it's grace, it's mercy.
It is, and I
so
learned what real grace is, because I was held and reassured that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my young children would be fine, regardless of whether I lived or died.
And you felt this palpably.
It was very physical. It was the experience of holding a little baby and pouring all of yourself into that baby, but I was the baby. Christ was loving me so purely and completely as though I were that little baby. I mean, pouring himself into my very being. It was something, obviously, I can't really describe. We don't have the vocabulary for it, but...
So what happens at this point?
So
suddenly,
I was then taken through a life review, and...
Okay, people always talk about this, so it's obviously true. People say, my life flashed before my eyes. Really, I have another friend, I wrote a book called Miracles, and I tell her story. She says within in a nanosecond, her entire life, she just like you're describing. This happened to you.
It did, but I would say it was both a nanosecond and an eternity.
That's the problem. It's always both. When you step outside of time.
Yes, it's both. All of eternity was in every moment, and every moment encompassed all of eternity. And
you're freaking me out.
And Jesus sort of pull out an event from my life that I would otherwise have thought was horrible, tragic, sad, something. And I would not only re-experience it from my own perspective and my own life, but I would re-experience it not just from each person's perspective, but it was as though I became those people and I had a complete understanding of their backstory, their life story, everything in their life that brought them to that moment in time where they hurt me or I hurt them. And what I discovered in that part of the life review was true grace and what that really meant. Because what I discovered is that when you have absolute understanding of the backstory of the sum total of hurts and joys and sorrows and challenges, there's no room for destructive emotion because it's all about love. Because when you actually understand, you don't feel anger or regret or revenge or shame or any of those other emotions. In our country, we talk about forgiveness, but as we typically talk about forgiveness, there's always a second part to the sentence. Well, I forgive you, but I'm never going to forget. Or I forgive you, but I don't ever want to see you again. I mean, there's always a but. And what I learned about God's grace, true grace, is there's no second part to the sentence. Because with understanding is this absolute grace and acceptance. And it's not even forgiveness. Grace is sort of this forgiveness in action. And that was powerful because even today...
So you experienced this palpably while you're underwater, trapped in this kayak. You experienced all these things.
Absolutely. As palpably as I'm sitting here in the studio.
I think more palpably.
Right.
Okay, so what else happened? So are you conscious physically of still being in the kayak?
Well, I was. It was a very strange thing because I'm a very analytical sort of person and somewhat cynical, and I was experiencing these things and I was being shown the beauty that came out of every one of these events. But then there was a parallel thought balloon that was looking at this thinking, wow, what is going on here? This is really strange. I know that I've been underwater too long to be alive, yet I felt more alive than I have ever felt. And I was looking at this thinking, I don't know, what am I? Where am I? So I kept doing self-assessment exams, and I would take a moment and think about my breathing and think about, well, okay, maybe I have an air pocket. Am I actually breathing? And so I'd think about that. I would think about, okay, can I feel the plastic of the boat? And yes, I could still feel the weight of the water. So I was sort of simultaneously still present within the physical reality of the earth, but simultaneously I was in a very different place. And then Christ sort of released my spirit from heaven as my body came out of the boat. And
okay, so wait. So you are in this boat under all this water for 30 minutes, and you're having this experience with Jesus. At what point and how are you rescued physically?
Well, I was never rescued in the sense of I was never found and pulled out of the boat. The current started working on my body, and the current eventually pulled my body over the front deck of the boat. And even as that happened, for example, my knees bent back on themselves, and I could feel the bones breaking.
Hold on. We're not all surgeons here. Your knees bent back on themselves. I remember reading this in the book, and it is so horrifying. So you're telling me that you're like a rag doll under tons of water.
Yes.
And it's ripping you, and it breaks your knees.
Yes. And I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I know what broken bones feel like. And I could feel them breaking. And going back to this idea of the self-assessment exams, I sort of took a moment and I thought, okay, my bones are breaking. I must be screaming. And so I sort of took a moment to say, am I feeling pain? And I didn't. I felt great.
I'm feeling pain just hearing this.
I know.
Okay, so you're aware of the fact that your knees are being broken in the wrong direction, or that's redundant. They're being bent in the wrong direction, and somehow does this free you from the boat, or does it free the boat from the rocks?
The boat was still stuck in the rocks. It freed my body from the boat, and so then my body was swept downstream.
Okay, so when your knees break and it allows your body
to come over the front deck of the boat.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
So you now are floating.
Well, no, because as my body was sort of coming over the front deck of the boat, I felt like me, my spirit, the real me, was sort of peeling away from my body. And when my body broke free from the boat, it was as though my spirit sort of broke free from my body. I kind of shook out.
So what happened to your body?
My body then went downstream.
Okay, so your body goes downstream, and what happens to you?
I was sort of released up into what I believe is heaven. And I was immediately greeted by a group of people, spirits, beings, never quite sure what to call them, who were overjoyed to welcome me and greet me. And it was only then that I could look back at the scene of the river,
Right.
and my body had actually bumped into one of the guys who was in the water getting my life jacket, which had been ripped
man,
off.
hold on. This is amazing. Folks, we're going to be right back. We're talking to Mary Neal, MD. 7 Lessons from Heaven is the book. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Stick around. Turn back to Mary Neal, MD. Mary Neal, your story is mind-blowing. The book is 7 Lessons from Heaven. So you talk about this moment where your knees break. Now, you walked in here, you seem fine. So your knees are clearly doing okay now.
They're okay.
They're okay. But but they bend in the right direction is my point.
Yes, true.
And so when this happens, your body floats down the stream and bumps into somebody.
Right. The current had also ripped off my helmet and life jacket. My life jacket popped up downstream.
I mean, this is quite a current. It ripped off your helmet and life jacket. People don't think that a life jacket and a helmet can be ripped off by water.
Right. Well, they can.
After 30 minutes of the power.
Right.
But I mean, this is incredible. So, but where are you? You said your body
So,
goes downstream.
my
but
body goes downstream,
your
but
spirit goes to heaven.
I'm in heaven. And as I said
Literally.
earlier, there was a shift in time and dimension. So I was there being welcomed and greeted and was overcome with this incredible sensation of being home, of where I really belong, where we all really belong. And it was such that I could be there, but at the same time look back at the scene on the river, and I could see the guy who grabbed my wrist pull me to shore. I could see them start CPR, and it was actually only then that I looked at it and I thought, well, okay, I guess I did die, and it was a bit surprising to me at the time, and I'm only a little embarrassed to say it, but I recognized that was my body, and I recognized that it represented my life on Earth, and I had a great life. I mean, I had a wonderful husband, 4 little kids that I loved dearly, a great job, no issues, no problems. I had every reason in the world to come back. But when I looked at my body, I knew that I was never coming back. I had absolutely no intention. And
in other words, where you were, you felt, I'm home, this is where I belong.
I am home, and it was a place that was so intensely beautiful and pervasive with God's love. And the love that we feel on earth is very pale in comparison to God's love. And my lack of desire to come back can only really be understood when juxtaposed to God's presence. And it was incredibly beautiful. For me, what has always moved my soul are colors and the intensity of colors and flowers and the aromas. And so that's what I experienced. And one of the things I think is so beautiful is that with near-death experiences, we all describe love and we all describe beauty, but the details are different, which I think actually speaks to their truth, because if it were just a physiologic process, it'd all be the same.
Right. Well, so you are in heaven, literally. And you said you're surrounded by, you're not sure what, people, angels.
Well, I don't know. They're not angels. They're people or departed beings. It's just
They're
funny.
people.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what I would call them. It's hard because those words mean different things to different people.
But why? In other words, you really have a choice. They're either angels or people.
Well, no, angels are, if you're really going to talk about angels in the biblical sense, they're a particular entity.
That's what I'm
They're
saying.
not
So
people.
Angels have wings. They're
Right.
not people.
I would
So
call
you're in the
these-
presence of people.
I would call these people. And for me, they did have a physical form, head, arms, legs, that sort of a thing.
Sounds like people.
But, right. And I don't know if that's how they appeared to me because it was something I would understand, or if that's how we all
But
look.
what kind of beings could they be? I guess
Oh
I don't
no, I
understand.
think they were. I mean, they're people.
When we die
they
and go
were
to heaven,
people
we're still
that-
people.
Yes, and I would agree. I still had my same sensibilities. I would say that when I was there, I was my best self, if that makes sense. I didn't have any destructive feelings or emotions. The people that greeted me, I knew had been sent by God. I knew they were there to welcome me and make me feel loved and known. I knew that they were people who had known me and loved me as long as I've existed. At that point in my life, I hadn't lost anyone I knew.
So this wasn't like a mother or father. This wasn't anybody that you knew.
Well, I think they were people who were important in my life story, meaning, let's say, a grandparent that died before I was born,
Right.
or a great-grandparent.
But you didn't recognize anybody. You didn't say Uncle Joe.
But I hadn't lost anyone
Right.
at that point.
Right.
And so, no, I didn't recognize anyone, but I knew on a very deep level that they knew me and I knew them, and they were important in my life story. And they were so overjoyed to welcome me, and they started taking me down this incredibly beautiful path. I mean, everything was so brilliantly radiant from within, and everything, even the robes they were wearing, this path was almost as though it was woven together with fibers of love, even though I realize that doesn't
You
make
hear
sense
people,
in our
whenever
language.
I read accounts of heaven or anything like that, you end up resorting to things like, the path was woven together with fibers of love. And to us, we say, what? What does that
I know
mean?
it doesn't make sense, but
Because you're talking about another world. You're talking about
exactly.
a world where those things are possible. And
That's
so it's
exactly
impossible
right.
for us to describe it.
I always try to explain it by saying that if we lived in a two-dimensional world,
Yeah.
we would understand lines and circles and points
Yeah.
and things like that, but we would have no language to describe, and we'd have no understanding of a cube. And we'd have no ability to
Right.
understand that we were existing within a cube.
Of course. No, this is what I love is, when you talk about experiences of eternity or whatever, how in this world do you describe it? Very tough. We're going to be right back, folks. We're talking to Mary Neal. The book is 7 Lessons from Heaven, How Dying Taught Me to Live a Joyful Life. If you don't buy a copy, you might be crazy. Hey there, folks. A little Peter Frampton for you. I really believe that eternity is both outside of time and also 1975. That's my theory. Mary, you died, you went to heaven, you experienced what it is to be in eternity, which is to say in a world outside of time and outside of space as we perceive it. So it does become impossible to try to really describe what you're talking about. So you're being led down some glorious path by these people who obviously live in heaven.
Right.
And what are you experiencing?
Well, I experienced many things. Mostly, I experienced pure, absolute, unconditional love. I was loved beyond our ability to understand. I've actually come to truly appreciate the descriptions in the Bible or in other people's accounts of spiritual experiences, because we all use these analogies because there isn't the language to describe it. And I felt so alive and really excited. They were taking me down this path to what I knew was the point of no return. And I was so excited to get there.
It's
And
kind of
this
like
path-
listening to this. I think I cannot wait to die.
Well, but it's an opportunity to be here on Earth, and we all have work to do.
No, I know,
And
I
so
know that,
I'm
but I'm
looking
saying
forward to going back.
when I fear death,
Oh, no.
I think of
There's-
these descriptions, and you think, oh my
Oh, no,
gosh.
there's nothing to fear.
Oh, my gosh.
Absolutely nothing. And I believe that God presents to each one of us the experience at the time of our death that will speak to us, that will make us feel known and loved and welcomed. And as I said earlier, for me, it's color, for example, and the flowers and the aromas. And this pathway is something that's impossible to describe. It sort of existed in the vastness of eternity. It doesn't make sense, but it was woven together with love and color, and it was as though I could see every color of the rainbow and some that aren't in the rainbow. But in addition to seeing them, I could experience them and understand them, and it was all simultaneous yet individual colors. It was as though the closest I've ever been able to come is to talk about the northern lights. You can't quite identify what color you're seeing. You can't really identify the edges, and they're constantly changing. And so it was really overwhelmingly beautiful for me. If I had heard beautiful music, that wouldn't have spoken to me.
Yeah.
But again, that's one of the things I think is really wonderful. I know when my husband dies, he'll hear beautiful music, and that will make him feel loved and welcomed. And it was a most remarkable experience because I'd be going down this path, and I still had some connection to, or I was still very aware of the scene at the river, and I could see one of the guys who was doing CPR, who was a very young man at the time, calling to me. I'd say, "Mary, please come back and take a breath. I know you're still here." And I have to add that the people on the river, these friends of ours at that time, were not particularly godly people. I mean, they were good people, but faith was not a big part of it for them.
They weren't commanding you to come back in the name of Jesus.
No. And I would listen, and this guy was sort of a very vulnerable sort of guy and kind of fluffy, and I would be overcome with compassion for him. And I would say to the people who were taking me down this path, "Okay, just a minute, I'll be right back." And I would go back down this pathway, I would lie down, and I would take a breath. And then I would immediately...
Are you kidding?
No, then I'd immediately rejoin these people.
Cow.
And we'd get a little bit further. He would start calling. I would say, "Just a minute, I'll be right back." I'd go back. I would take a breath. And that cycle went on multiple times. And it was very interesting to talk to him after the fact because I'm a very concrete thinking person. He was asking me to come back and take a breath, which I interpret as one. And that's what I was doing. And so I was very frustrated because he kept pulling me back, and I kept trying to give him what he wanted. And he was frustrated because I would take a breath and then there would be nothing. But we did eventually...
Okay, now
Okay.
let's be perfectly logical and scientific. In the natural, quote unquote, what you're describing makes no sense. A corpse or somebody who is dead and not breathing, to take a breath is to come back to life. But what you're describing is you take a breath and you don't breathe again. And then later on, you take another breath. That makes no sense, right?
Well, none of it makes sense.
No, I know. But I'm saying so the normal thing
Right.
would be either you come back or you don't.
Right.
Either you take a breath and now you're back,
Right.
or you don't. But you're saying that you would take a breath and then you'd be gone again.
Yes.
And then later on, you'd take a breath, and it's just it's madness. It's amazing.
It's crazy.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Wow.
No, it's something that in my wildest imagination I could not come up with.
Now, your husband was not at the scene.
No, he wasn't. Actually, he had dropped us off at the beginning of the river and went off and found a sunny place to read.
Yeah.
So he knew none of this except that he would say that there was a certain point in time he all of a sudden had this incredible feeling that everything's fine. Everything was fine. And he was not a spiritual guy at all.
At that time.
No. And there were so many things that happened. Eventually, I was, as my kids would say, I was kicked out, and I was given this whole laundry list of things I still had to do, including what I'm doing here, which is sharing my experience with other people.
But so wait a second. So you're in heaven, and at what point did they say, okay, you can't keep walking down this path, you need to go back?
Well, we arrived at this entrance, sort of this archway to this dome structure of sorts, and we were there again for what seemed to me like many hours. And during that time, I had this absolute understanding of the divine order of the universe, not the nature of the universe, but the order of the universe and how we are all interconnected and all of that sort of thing. And then eventually one of the people, sort of the leader of the group, told me it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do on Earth, and that I had to go back. And
Did they mention this show specifically?
I think they did.
They said, you got to go back and do the Eric Metaxas show.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, I still can't get over, it's such a joy to hear your story. Absolutely joyful. I know there are people listening right now. Their lives are being changed. So we're going to have a little David Cassidy, and we'll be right back to talk to Mary Neal.
Step short of our heaven, then we won't stop short till we get there together. Together, baby, we're better. You sheltered me from harm, kept me warm, kept me warm.
Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. A few minutes left with Mary Neal. The book is 7 Lessons from Heaven. Mary Neal, you said that neither you or your husband were on any level serious about Christian faith. You were good people. At what point did all of that change? I mean, because we haven't even gotten to the point where we're going to do a second hour so people can listen to the rest of this amazing story. But at what point did your faith become what it is today?
My life changed the moment I asked God's will to be done, because it was at that moment that this great adventure began that was so filled with the reality of God's presence, the reality of God's love, and the miracles that occurred subsequently, that what happened to me and what I believe can happen to all people is all of a sudden I didn't just hope that God was real and present. I didn't hope that God's promises were true or kind of believe they were, but I had an absolute trust. And it was that moment in time that my life changed, because once you really trust that God's promises are true, it cannot help but be transformational.
In other words, you knew that they were true.
I know. I've oftentimes said I was sort of sad because I lost my faith, but I gained knowledge. Because knowing they're true means that it's not even just a matter of, quote, living my faith, but and I'm not going to call it faith, my trust is a part of every breath I take. It is a part of every thought I think. It is a part of every fiber of my being.
Well, I would say you're living in reality.
I think so, too.
No, but I mean, the point is people act like faith is a choice or faith. No. It's like saying, I choose to believe 2 + 2 = 4.
Yes.
You're a fool if you think you're choosing it. It's either true or it's not. And if it's true, it's true. It's not a matter of, I believe that 2 + 2 = 4. So what we're talking about is a reality it's as real as, whatever, the atomic weight of beryllium, to pull something out of a hat. It is just reality.
Exactly.
And so once you realize this is real, you don't say like, oh, I hope it's true, or I believe. You just know it is. Yeah.
Absolutely true. And when you live it as a reality, it changes every human interaction. It changes the importance of every decision, every thought, every moment in time becomes different. And so I would agree. I think that's a great way of looking at it. It just is. It isn't that I'm hoping that it's true.
And of course, to quote William F. Buckley, the question becomes, why did you receive this gift? It's such an extraordinary gift, but I think, wow, why didn't I get that? What my listeners are wondering, that would be amazing. That would be,
Well, the interesting comment to that, though, is we both asked the question of why, albeit from very different perspectives. You asked the question of why did you get to come back? And why do you have this experience? And my question is, why did I have to come back, number one?
Yeah.
And why did I have to have this experience? Because there's nothing on this list of things that I was given to do that I would have signed up for. I certainly... like most people, I don't like public speaking.
Okay, so you mean God gave you a list. You need to go back. You don't get to stay in heaven because you've got this stuff to do.
I have a laundry list of things that...
And one of the things you're doing is you're speaking about it publicly on this radio program. People's lives are being touched. Okay, we're going to have a second hour with you, Mary Neal. But thank you so much for being my guest. This is
Thank
tremendous.
you. It is such a privilege to share.
What a joy. Folks, that's the show. Tell your friends.
Welcome to the Eric Metaxas Show.
Did you know that Eric wears dentures that have been in his family for generations?
It's true. They're discolored and disgusting.
But they have deep personal meaning for Eric, so we ask that you respect that.
And now your host,
Eric Metaxas.
Oh, my goodness. And that's why I don't eat blueberry pie anymore. Terribly staining food. Folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. Look, I'm talking for this hour to someone with whom you need to be familiar. I don't say that lightly. Neal, MD, that's medical doctor, has written a book called 7 Lessons from Heaven, How Dying Taught Me to Live a Joy-Filled Life. Mary, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be back.
It's a joy. And when you say it's a privilege to be back, do you mean to this world from heaven, or do you mean back to this program?
I would say both.
Oh, thank you. You died and went to heaven. I'm not speaking metaphorically, although I guess I'm speaking metaphorically and literally. I want to make sure that people understand that you tell the story of drowning in a kayak accident in 1999. You told that story in your previous book, To Heaven and Back. And in this book, 7 Lessons from Heaven, you get into it. But you died, you experienced the presence of Jesus. You were not a Christian by my understanding of Christian at that time. You were just living your life, good person, 4 kids, loving husband, great job as a spine surgeon. And then you have this accident. You experience heaven. So you were talking in the first hour about how God basically sent you back. You wanted to stay, and you hear this story over and over. People are like, this is the greatest thing ever. I want to stay. But the people you were with said, your time is not yet. You need to go back.
Yes. And I had been reassured early on by Christ that everything would be fine, regardless of whether I lived or died.
Okay.
And, I was a self-confident, accomplished person. And so when they told me that it was my time, or that it wasn't my time and I had to go back, I did, of course, what I think is a reasonable thing to do, which is to say, no, I'm good. I can stay. And so that was...
You let them know that you wouldn't mind staying.
Right. I had no intention of coming back. But that was then when they first gave me this laundry list of things that I still had to do. And some of them have come to pass. Some of them haven't yet. One of the things had to do with sharing my experiences with other people. And in sharing my experiences, help other people make this transformation from a hope or a faith in God's promises to an absolute trust. One of the things that has come to pass had to do with the coming and unexpected death of my oldest son. And I, of course, asked why.
Okay, wait a
why
second.
My
So
son?
you were in heaven, and they shared the people you're with who are effectively speaking for God. They're talking to you. They're telling you need to go back. You need to do all these different things. And one of those things they reveal to you in 1999 when you're in heaven that your eldest son is going to die.
Yes.
How did that make you feel when you heard that in heaven?
Well, first of all, it didn't come as a surprise entirely, because when my oldest son was maybe 4 or 5, we were in conversation, and within that conversation, I said something to the effect of, well, Willie, when you're 18, something, I don't remember. And he said, but I'm never going to be 18. And my response to that was, what do you mean? And he looked up at me with the most innocent and pure expression and said, but Mama, that's the plan. And I'd never forgotten that. And so when I was told about his coming death, and at the time he was 9 years old, when I was told about that, it wasn't a total surprise, but I, of course, did say, well, why? No, not my son. And when I asked that question, I was immediately taken back to my life review, in which I had this incredible opportunity of seeing the beauty that came out of every event when seen from 25, 30, 35 times removed. And I had been shown again and again and again and again the truth of God's promise that beauty comes of all things. And so when I asked the question of why, I was immediately returned to that reality. And basically the point being made was, look, if you trust that God has a plan for each one of us that's one of hope, then you can trust that if the plan for your son doesn't change, then incredible beauty would have come out of his life and will come out of his death. And so it's all about trust. And so...
Now, when you say trust in God.
Trusting God's promises, all of them.
Yeah. Okay. So this is revealed to you in heaven. What else? What are you told you must do?
Well, as I said, some of the things have come to pass. The things that haven't, I don't talk about. I sort of, I do believe that God's plan for each one of us can change. And certainly when I came back, one of the things I did was try very diligently to disprove the reality of my account.
Really?
Because I knew that if I could come up with any sort of scientific or medical explanation for my experiences, then I would be able to discard everything I'd been told, including the coming death of my son. I mean, there was nothing on this list that was anything I would have said, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Okay,
I want to do
so
that.
you're given this list of things, and when you come back, you're thinking, I would prefer not to do all these things.
Not just prefer, I don't want to do any
You
of
don't
them.
want to do these things, and you've been told your son's going to die,
Right.
and you would love to say, I reject all that.
Yes, of course. And so I actually spent many, many, many months trying to really look at the science of dying, really look at every explanation anyone has ever thrown out there for near-death experiences, because I was very interested in grasping onto some alternative. And
Okay, so you've experienced Jesus, you've experienced all this, but I'm saying when you come back, you are not convinced that that was all real. You're in other words, you're open to the idea that there's other possibilities.
well, I was open to the idea in that I knew what I knew, and I knew it was a real experience, just as anyone who has a near-death experience or other really profound experience
Right.
knows it on an absolute level. But that said, yes, I absolutely would have been very happy and very content to find an alternative explanation so that I could discount what I'd been told.
Okay, got to go back real quick. So you're told all these things, and then what is this feeling of going back into your body? Like, can you just describe that? What happens?
Well, I've heard other people describe almost comical ways of trying to get back in their body, but for me it was very simple. We went back down this pathway. I sat in my body, I laid back, and then I was reunited.
It's like an old film or something like that, right?
Yes.
You just
it's silliness. But for me, it was very gentle, very smooth. There was no difficulty or popping or anything like that.
Except for the fact that your legs are grotesquely broken.
Well, they are. And that's when really another series of miracles occurred, because I opened my eyes and the people who resuscitated me, of course, were on one hand happy, but on the other were terrified because we were in a very, very inaccessible part of South America. The river was inaccessible. There's no way to get there. And they were thinking, oh my goodness, what now? And as they were thinking that, these two Chilean men just sort of appeared and never said anything. No one ever said anything
This
to
is
them.
this is in your first book or your
Yes.
second book? This is like one of these freaky things where logic would say these could have been angels because it makes no sense.
There's no question in my mind that they were angels. And they came over, put my body on top of a boat. One of them had a machete, and then they, with a couple of my friends, started trying to get me up the hillside.
An angel with a machete.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the title of my next novel.
Right.
Okay, so...
But then
Yeah.
one of the parts of this that I personally just find absolutely delightful is that after a number of hours of trying to get up the hillside and little dirt trails, we were in the middle of
Wait, now
nowhere.
you are now conscious?
Well, I was
You're
conscious,
going in and out
but
of
I
consciousness.
felt like I had 1 foot here and 1 foot still in heaven.
Okay, because you're basically you're half dead. I mean, you've just come
Yes.
back from so you're in misery, and they're trying to
No,
drag
actually,
you.
I wasn't in
You're not in misery,
misery. I
but
had no
but
pain.
but you're a mess, and they're trying to drag you up.
Yes, up the
Okay,
hillside.
we're gonna come right back, folks. I'm talking to Mary Neal. It's Neal. The book is 7 Lessons from Heaven. Stick around.
It isn't so. Some people want
who has gone to heaven and came back. And of course, I want to know, Mary, were there Bee Gees songs in heaven? Did you see Andy Gibb? Did you see any of the Bee Gees?
Well, I listen to country western
Oh, your
music.
microphone. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I listen to country western music, so
Right.
no, I didn't hear any of that.
And you didn't see Mel Tillis because he wasn't dead in 1999. But if you went to heaven now, you might see Mel.
Perhaps.
Amazing. Okay, so we're going back to the fact that you go back into your body, you're half alive, and they're trying to drag you to help somehow.
Well, they would admit they'd never really had a plan because there weren't towns, there weren't medical services.
Where were they thinking of taking you? I mean, where were you?
Well, they had this vague idea that once we hit a dirt road, one of them would start running and perhaps find a horse and come back with a horse and then load me onto the horse. So maybe then we could go somewhere faster. We didn't have cell phones and sat phones.
Okay, but the point is that you were expecting to kayak someplace.
Yes.
And because you didn't do that, now you're having to take this journey over land. That was not the plan.
Exactly.
And it's highly inconvenient.
Yes. That's one way of putting it.
Right.
Highly inconvenient. The hillsides were very thickly coated in bamboo, and so travel was very difficult. And there weren't medical services. Here in the U.S., even in the wilderness, we can use a sat phone or a cell phone and call search and rescue, but they really don't have those things there. In 1999, in this part of southern Chile, they didn't even have ambulances. There's nothing. I mean, it's very, very remote. And so they will admit that they didn't really have a plan, except they knew they had to keep going forward somehow. And after a number of hours, we emerged onto a little dirt road, and exactly where we emerged was an ambulance. And
There was an ambulance where you emerged.
Yes.
In the middle of nowhere in southern Chile.
Yes.
I think that's a great it's an amazing coincidence.
It's not a coincidence.
Isn't it wonderful how the universe plans?
No, it's a miracle. And the ambulance driver, I believe, was another angel, because the ambulance driver, again, got out. And I'm in healthcare. I mean, any reasonable situation, the ambulance driver would have hopped out. First of all, wouldn't have been there in southern Chile, but would have at least gotten out and said, okay, what's the story here? Like, what's going on? What's wrong with this person? And would have at least had a conversation, collected information.
You have to kind of figure out what's going on.
Exactly. But the ambulance driver, who these friends of mine would say was dressed like a 4 or 5-year-old would imagine an ambulance driver is supposed to be dressed, like it was kind of off. He got out and never said a word, didn't ask any questions. The only thing he ever said was when one of my friends said, "Whoa, oh my goodness, what are you doing here?" All he said was waiting. That was it. That's all he ever said. And
So you're in the middle of nowhere and you come upon an ambulance waiting for you.
yes.
Sounds like you're still dreaming. I mean, this is just
Right.
amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And then I was loaded into the ambulance, and my husband actually arrived at that moment as well, because during CPR, in typical American fashion, one person wanted to videotape everything. One person, of course, didn't want them to resuscitate me. And one person just sort of took off running. She just sort of freaked out, and she ended up running, and I believe under divine guidance, ended up running to where my husband had parked his car for the day. And so they then drove downriver, and they arrived at the point we emerged at the same moment. And so then we loaded into the ambulance and drove for a couple hours and found a little medical outpost. And later in the day, the friends of mine went back to the river and spent the afternoon trying to find out information about the 2 guys who had helped, or the ambulance driver. And of course, as you might expect, were met with blank stares. I mean, no one had ever heard of this. There was no such thing as ambulances. No, I absolutely believe that all 3 of those people were angels.
Except, this is what's so funny. I love this stuff, because then now I want to ask, okay, if the ambulance driver's an angel, where's the ambulance from? Is that from heaven? Like this, you know what I'm saying?
Right. I know. I don't have an answer. One of the...
Did you get the serial number?
I know, exactly. I don't even know if I had a license plate.
Right.
I don't know. It's so remarkable. But I will tell you, one of the things that this experience has done for me is, even though I certainly asked the question and I certainly am intellectually curious,
Yeah.
I have absolutely given up the need to always know the question or the answer to the question of why.
The only reason I ask is for those who don't believe. In other words, there are people listening and they're thinking, what do you make of this? This is so crazy. You know, and it's fun to me to explore every detail. You just think this is so rich and amazing. And you just want to know what, you know. The reason I say that is because having written a book on miracles, I think there is a reality and we haven't mapped it yet. It's like if you discovered that, I think there are, I think that they're like when they were discovering the periodic table, they're thinking there's this reality and there's atomic structure, and they begin to map it out. When you're talking about heaven, near-death experiences, you begin to see patterns and things, and you know, you don't just say, "Hey, whatever." You say there's something
Absolutely.
real here, and what is it, and how does it work? And,
there's no question, and I absolutely have those same questions. And I think that as we, through science, continue to explore the answers to how things happen, I think we'll begin to realize how little we actually know.
Oh.
I mean, we know and understand so little.
There's no question.
But it's interesting to me because when you talk about people who would be listening who say, oh, that's not possible.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the problems is that we each decide how much evidence we need to believe something.
Correct. That's right.
And sometimes we need very little.
Right.
We just need it to be printed on Facebook or something.
Right.
And sometimes we want a lot of evidence. And what I've discovered is that when it comes to spiritual realities, people want absolute tangible proof.
Yeah.
And they would like to say that that's not there. I would say that it is. I would say that any given person can look back at the reality of their life and find tangible presence of God's love.
Oh no, there's no
direction.
to me. There's no question about that. In fact, I didn't say this publicly when I wrote my Miracles book, but after reading the accounts in the book, which are none of them are quite like yours, but you just say, listen, folks, it's obvious you can prove the existence of God. Do you think all these people are lying? Do you think in other words, it's proof? There's way more proof than you need, but there's some people no proof will be enough. And
well, that's exactly right. And I think for those people, the reality is they don't actually want it to be true.
Correct.
Because for many people, it's very inconvenient. If God's promises are actually true, they might have to change the way they behave, or they might have to change their lifestyle.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it is so liberating. If you truly get to the point, and I believe it's always looking back at your own life, not just believing someone else's story. I absolutely believe if you can make that transformation to trust, which I believe every person can. You don't need to die for that to happen.
I'm so glad to hear that.
All of a sudden, you are so liberated because if you can accept grace, like true grace, meaning my past, I blew it, I missed the mark, but it's gone. I don't have to be defined by my past. I don't have to hang on to my past. And there really is life after death. And there really is a God who knows me and loves me and has a plan for my life that's one of hope. If I absolutely trust both of those realities, I don't have to be feeling regret or guilt. I don't have to feel anxiety. I can be absolutely free and liberated to be fully present right now, right here in this moment, and be in complete communication with God and feel God's love.
Well, that's the thing. People think like, if I do that, then I have to do this, then I have to do that. And you could be 80 years old or 90 or whatever, and God says, I can give you eternity and infinity now. Don't worry about what you've done or whatever. I can give you eternity because I'm God.
Exactly.
And if you have 1 year to live or 1 week to live, I can give you all of eternity in that week. Don't worry about what you've done or you didn't do or whatever. And all you have to do is submit to me and I'll give it to you, but I won't force you. Okay, but this gets to your story. So you come back and now you're not so sure you want to really submit to all this. There's a lot of things you have to do. You're not so, So what is the journey there?
Well, I came back and it took me many months of research to conclude that my experience had been real and true. And then it took me many years to figure out, okay, what does that mean? And I'm very good at procrastinating, and I came up with all kinds of reasons why I didn't really need to follow through with some of the things. Like I didn't really need to share my experience with other people because I really didn't want to.
Of course, because those people may think you're nuts. And we're going to be right back, folks. I'm talking to Mary Neal, MD. This is amazing. The book is 7 Lessons from Heaven. This is the Eric Metaxas Show, metaxastalk.com.
Just like a blind man wandered along, where isn't this a gleamful?
Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to the author of 7 Lessons from Heaven, How Dying Taught Me to Live a Joy-Filled Life. Mary Neal, you died and came back. And so when you did come back, just to get back to the story here, you were not convinced you needed to do the things that you were told you needed to do in heaven. And so you go through this process of figuring it out.
I did. And I woke up every day hoping the plan for my son's life would change, but I woke up every day wondering if that would be the day that he died. And outside of an absolute trust in God's promises, that would be impossible. But I had an absolute trust that if the plan for his life did not change, that indeed great beauty would have come of his life, great beauty would come out of his death. And so I basically tried to just go back to my life, which I might add was sort of impossible after an experience like this. But I kept putting things off until 2009, when one morning I was sort of woken up very early, maybe 4 a.m.
Okay, this is 10 years after the accident.
10 years later. And at this point, I will say that my son did reach his 18th birthday. There were some things that happened leading up to his birthday that made me think that the plan for his life had changed. And actually on his 18th birthday, when he was still alive, I told him this entire story. And on that particular day then in 2009, I was woken up. I was placed on the ground. It was as though God were saying, okay, today you're going to say yes to what I asked you to do. And I oftentimes say that asking for God's will to be done underwater was the first day my life changed. But really, this day in 2009 is truly what changed my life, because it wasn't just a matter of accepting the truth of God's promises, but it was saying, yes, I will be obedient. I will.
Okay, up to this point now, so in these 10 years from 99 to 2009, were you going to church? Would you describe yourself as serious about Jesus or no?
Absolutely.
You were?
Because it was part of every breath. It was, as you described earlier, the truth of God's reality was my reality. And so absolutely.
Okay, so you've given your life to Jesus and all that has changed.
Yes.
And what about your husband?
My husband, I would say, had a very different experience. He, at the time of my drowning, was terrified. He was terrified of losing me. He was, when we eventually made it back to the U.S., I shouldn't have survived then. And he was filled with terror because, fortunately, he really loved me. He couldn't even listen to the whole story.
Yeah, it must have been horrifying. Yeah.
It was horrifying. We still had 4 little kids. I mean, he oftentimes back then said, well, you were off talking to God, but I was changing diapers. I mean, it was a very different experience. He since then has changed. I mean, he grew up in a very actively atheistic household, and I would say that now he is a very spiritual guy.
Yeah.
He is a very faithful guy. He knows the truth of God's promises.
Yeah.
But during those 10 years, it was very difficult because the first year and a half, I was physically present but not emotionally present. I, like so many people who have a near-death experience, was really very depressed. I couldn't believe that I was here. I just couldn't believe that I was sent back.
Wow.
And
okay,
that's a common experience.
Okay, so 10 years into this, God wakes you up somehow.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what you mean God woke you up,
Well,
but you had a sense that this is God waking you up?
I had an absolute overwhelming sensation that, okay, now is the day you're going to say yes. And I said yes. And I spent the next week writing the manuscript for the first book I wrote, To Heaven and Back. And then I did some revisions, and that was that. And I kind of put it to the side.
And you wrote it because you felt that God told you, when you go back, I want you to tell what happened to you.
I was expected to share my experiences with other people.
Right.
I was given some pretty clear guidelines, and I knew that
Anything
writing was
you
part
can
of
share?
that. Well, for example, I knew that speaking and I knew that writing about it was one of those expectations, because writing is a very efficient way to share your experience with a lot of people. And so I knew that one of the expectations was to write about it. But I'm not a writer. I just really didn't want to do it. I mean, so
I am a writer, and I don't like writing either. So
Okay.
It's hard work. It's hard work. People don't realize.
Right. So I did that, and then I put it to the side. And then on January 21st, 2009, it was again as though I was shaken awake and said, today is the day you're going to finish this. You are going to complete what I asked you to do. And so I got up and I made some revisions. And when I hit the save button for the final time, you can imagine how excited I was. I was elated.
You were elated because you had done your assignment.
Yes. And my youngest son and I then drove into town to get ice cream and celebrate because I was so happy. And as we were driving into town, I called my older boys who were in the ski training program.
Yeah.
And it was then that the coach picked up the phone and told me my son had been hit by a car and killed.
I mean, the timing is obviously God's timing.
It was a gift.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. And although I like to say I had all these excuses for not writing,
Right.
I believe it was really an example of God's perfect timing.
Folks, we'll be right back. I'm talking to Mary Neal, the book is 7 Lessons from Heaven.
Just think, looking up for a change in the weather. I get this feeling.
Dying taught me to live a joy-filled life. Mary, you cannot overstate the importance, I cannot overstate the importance of what we're talking about here. Every human being wants to know, why am I on this planet? Does life have meaning? Is there a God? If there is, what is that God like? What am I supposed to do about it? You have lived this, and you now live to answer these questions. That's why you're here. It's why you wrote this book.
Well, I'm not sure I'm here to answer the question entirely of why we're here, but I will tell you that coming to Earth is an incredible opportunity. We are here, and there is a plan for each one of us that's one of hope, and we need to be about God's business. I mean, so many of us just sort of go through our days and go through the motions, and we're just wasting time. I mean, we're just wasting this incredible opportunity.
What is more horrible than that?
Yes.
I've actually talked about this, the idea that this is an outrageous opportunity.
Right. And the question many people ask me, well, why do we have to come here to learn greater humility, compassion, understanding, kindness, all those things? And I don't have the answer to that. But I do know that this is an incredible opportunity, and we need to take advantage of it.
To do God's will.
Really, it's not only just doing God's will, but it's reflecting God's love to other people.
Well, that's what I mean. In other words, why are we here? And you're saying that we're not just here. God has a purpose for us, and we can't find real joy unless we do what He wants.
It's individual, because my plan is not the same as yours. And one of the problems, I think, is that we we talk about, oh, okay, well, we want to follow where God's leading, but not really, because we want to identify where he's leading us to decide whether we want to do that or not, whether we like that direction or not, or we say, well, no, we want to do that person's job. And as a result, we sort of overlook developing our own talents and our own gifts because we want someone else's gifts. And it's been an interesting journey, to say the least, for me, because, of course, none of this is what I actually wanted to sign up for. But it's been an incredible privilege. Since the writing of that first book, which I might add I didn't actually realize anyone would read, but many people did. And as a result of that, I've had this privilege of an opportunity of speaking with hundreds of thousands of people, listening to their own stories of not only near-death experiences, but really profound spiritual experiences, listening to their life story and being able to share with them my own observations. And it's really remarkable because everyone's worried about the same thing. I mean, everyone has regrets or sorrows from the past. Everyone has anxiety about the future. And everyone is going to face challenge. We're all going to die. Everyone's so afraid of dying that so many people never even live. And we know we are going to face challenges. And the fact is, when you talk about why we're here, we're not here to just have an easy life. None of us ever change when things are easy. We change in response to challenges. We can all look back at ourselves from 15 years ago and see the ways we've changed. None of us can ever imagine the ways we're going to change in the future, but we're going to change in response to the challenges we faced. And my passion currently is to help people face those challenges from a state of joy, because I believe that so many of us chase after happiness, but happiness is so transitory. I mean, it's like shifting sands. If things are good, you're happy. If it's sunny out, I'm happy. If it's raining, I'm not so happy. But that is all based on the external, whereas joy is really what allows us to transcend circumstances. And I believe that joy is based on an absolute trust in all of God's promises.
And how do you get to that place? In other words, I assume when you say God's promises, I assume you mean the promises that are in the Bible.
Yes.
And so I guess you have to be familiar with the Bible, or you have to be hanging out with people who actually believe this stuff.
Yes. I mean, God's promises are pretty straightforward. And they have to do with the fact that God is real and present, that God knows each one of us individually, loves each one of us as though we're the only ones, and has a plan for each one of us that's one of hope. And really, if you don't know anything more than that, that's life-changing. But my passion is not only to have people understand those promises, but to really trust the truth of them. And trust is sort of faith in action. Trust is a choice based on evidence.
Right.
And I wrote the second book as a response to hearing all of these people talk about things and share things and ask questions, because I believe that every single person can make the same transformation from sort of hoping that it's true, trusting it's true, to an absolute trust that those promises are true. And you don't have to die. You don't have to have a profound spiritual experience. I challenge people all the time not to believe what I'm saying, because my job is not to convince anyone of anything. My job is to share my experiences, and what I really hope happens is they try to prove me wrong, that they try to go home and say, well, you know what, it's easier for her to have trust because she had this incredible experience, but God's not present in my life. Because I absolutely know that if people will actually spend the time, put out the effort to look at their own life, they will absolutely see evidence of God's presence, evidence that can't be made up. You can look at evidence statistically, and there will be enough evidence in every single person's life to be able to realize that statistically, that's just not possible.
Exactly. This is what I find funny. We were talking about it earlier, that the evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible it's ridiculously overwhelming, but we live in a world where it's fairly easy to ignore it. I mean, if you turn on the TV, the narrative is not there's a God who loves you and has a plan for your life, and it's okay to give yourself to him. You just don't even hear that.
No, I think one of the problems in our culture, and this is one of the realizations I came to after doing all the research, trying to disprove my own account,
Right.
is that one of the problems is we're presented with this false choice for our entire life. We either choose to believe in science or we can choose to believe in God.
I'm going to cut you off there because we have one final break and we're going to come back. This is a big point. Folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to Mary Neal. Stick around. Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. A few minutes left with Mary Neal, the author of 7 Lessons from Heaven. So, Mary, you died, and when you talk now, it's different than if somebody else were to say it. But many people dismiss what people like you say. They just think there's no way that can be true. And you said we're presented with this false narrative.
Right. Because we are told we have to choose to believe in science or believe in God and spirituality. And what I've discovered is that is a false choice. It's like saying you have to choose an orange or an apple. The fact is science will always be the means by which we try to understand how things happen. But spirituality will always provide the answer to why. And they coexist very easily. And I know that one of my missions is to point out that false narrative. They can coexist, and they do coexist, and they should coexist in every person's life. We're given the gift of intellectual curiosity, and we should question things. I don't take everyone at face value.
Right.
That would be foolish.
Right.
But at the same time, you also can't discount everything. You know, it's that whole idea that not everything is a miracle, but you'd be foolish to say that nothing is.
Right.
The fact is there are miracles. And the fact is that choosing to trust God's promises is transformational and is life-changing. Many people have said, well, so what? So what does it do for me on a daily basis? Why should I put out the effort to look? And, of course, my real attitude is, well, because this is an eternal issue. This isn't a day-to-day issue. But beyond that, on a daily basis, it absolutely radically changes human interaction. If I come across someone who I don't like, for whatever reason, I don't look like them, they don't agree with me. Of course, there's always us and them. If I come across someone I don't like, I can immediately remind myself of 2 things. First of all, they are as intensely loved by God as I know God loves me, and that changes how I experience them. I recognize that. I look for God within them. I try to feel love for them. And where God's love is present, or where love is present, there's no room for destructive emotion. And so all of a sudden, I start to like them. All of a sudden, it's not me and them, it's us. In addition to which, if someone hurts me, I don't feel emotional response to that. I don't feel anger or resentment because I can look at that person and I absolutely accept that they have a backstory, that they have a life story that brought them to that point where they hurt me or said something hurtful. And even though I don't know what their story is, I can trust that that story is there. And so it changes my experience of life. And I believe it can change every person's experience of life. And I can only imagine for a moment if everyone on the earth were able to actually accept the intensity of God's love for them and reflect that to the other people. Oh, my goodness. We'd obviously have a very radically different world.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you, of course. It's such big stuff. I'm so glad you took the trouble to write the second book because I know in many ways it's very different from the first book. You really get into some stuff here.
It is. One of the goals of the second book is to not only address all of these questions, but to really lay out a very practical way of making that transformation to trust. And of course, it's not for everyone. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's a very analytical way of collecting information and collecting evidence to try to make that transformation.
We're unfortunately out of time, but it is practical because people think, what do I do? What do I do? Right. Well, I think first step, buy the book. Mary, just a great joy. God bless you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. It is an incredible privilege.
Folks, I think this was pretty sweet. I hope you'll tell your friends and share it. Share the podcast. Get the word out. Thank you.